25 no. Something felt different this time. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just different. You could feel it in the pause before the laughter. In the way people looked at each other like, wait, did he really just go there? And then came the reaction. Not outrage. Not panic. Relief. Because for the first time in a long time, someone said the thing out loud. What made this moment stand out wasn't just the joke itself, it was who said it, who it was about, and what didn't happen afterward. No social media firestorm. No mass condemnation. No coordinated outrage cycle. Just laughter. Real laughter. The kind that only shows up when people feel like a pressure valve has finally been released. And that's why this wasn't just comedy. It felt like a turning point. 4 years now, certain public figures have existed behind an invisible shield. A mix of prestige, identity politics, and perfectly managed PR made them functionally untouchable. Criticism wasn't debated, it was dismissed. Questioning motives wasn't allowed, it was labeled. And comedians, of all people, learned to steer clear. Not because they lacked material, but because the risk wasn't worth it. Until suddenly, someone didn't care. And when that shield cracked, the response wasn't anger. It was recognition. Now, let's be clear before anyone twists this into something it's not. This isn't about hate. It's not about denying that unfair criticism exists or pretending that certain attacks haven't crossed real lines. Those things are real. They matter. But what people are exhausted by is something else entirely. They're tired of the performance, the endless self-narration, the constant framing of every setback as historic oppression, the way every appearance, every interview, every project somehow loops back to the same story, told the same way, with the same emotional beats. At a certain point, people stop asking, is this unfair? And start asking, is this real? And that's where the shift happens. For a long time, criticism of certain celebrities didn't feel organic. It felt forbidden. You could sense that people had thoughts they never said out loud, jokes they never told, questions they never asked. Not because those thoughts were cruel, but because they didn't fit the approved narrative. And narratives only work as long as people believe in them. What made this moment land wasn't cruelty. It was contrast. The contrast between the image that's been carefully built and the reaction of an audience that no longer feels obligated to play along. Because when someone truly holds cultural power, the crowd doesn't flinch. They defend. They rush in. They police the moment. That didn't happen here. Instead, people laughed and kept laughing. And laughter is dangerous. Not because it's mean, but because it signals that the spell is broken. Once people can joke about something again, it means they're no longer afraid of it. The subject is no longer sacred. It's just human. Fallible. Fair game. That's what made this moment feel bigger than one person or one joke. It exposed how much the cultural mood has changed. For years, Hollywood embraced a very specific kind of celebrity activism. The kind that looks meaningful, sounds inspiring, and photographs well, but rarely produces anything concrete. It worked because people wanted to believe in it. They wanted heroes. They wanted stories with clear villains and brave protagonists. But over time, that goodwill gets spent. When every project is framed as groundbreaking, when every criticism is framed as persecution, when every platform is used to talk about oneself rather than the cause itself, eventually, people start asking a very simple question. What's actually being done? And that question is far more threatening than any insult. What we're seeing now isn't a pylon. It's a recalibration. A collective moment where people quietly decide they're done pretending not to notice the disconnect between words and results. That's why the silence afterward mattered more than the joke. Because silence meant consent. Not approval of cruelty, but permission to question again. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. This is the point where a public figure usually has two choices. Double down on the old strategy, more statements, more framing, more reminders of past grievances, or pause and reassess. Strip away the performance. Stop narrating. Start doing. The problem is, reinvention only works when it's real. Audiences are sharper than they get credit for. They can sense when something is calculated. They can tell when vulnerability is being used as a tool instead of a truth. And once that trust erodes, no amount of branding can buy it back. That's where we are right now. Not at the end of anyone's story, but at the end of an era where certain narratives went unchallenged by default. The era of automatic sympathy, automatic praise, automatic protection. And whether people want to admit it or not, a lot of viewers have been waiting for this moment. Waiting for someone to say, maybe there's more going on here. Waiting for the culture to loosen its grip just enough to allow honest conversation again. This wasn't about tearing someone down. It was about the crowd finally standing up and saying, without saying it at all, we're ready for something real. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid saying out loud. Stories don't fail all at once. They wear out. They get repeated, polished, refined, retold from every angle until the emotional impact fades. And then one day, the same story that once felt powerful starts to feel rehearsed. That's what's happening now. For a long time, the narrative worked because it fit the moment. It tapped into real conversations about inequality, power, and institutions that desperately needed scrutiny. People were ready to listen. They wanted accountability. They wanted change. And when someone arrived with the perfect story, outsider, disruption, and justice, it landed. Hard. But narratives are fragile. They depend on trust. And trust depends on consistency between words and reality. Once that consistency starts to wobble, the audience doesn't revolt immediately. They grow quiet, skeptical, less emotionally invested. They start noticing patterns, like how every setback somehow reinforces the same storyline, how every criticism is framed as proof of persecution, how every project is introduced with grand language, but rarely followed by tangible results. At first, people give grace. A lot of it. They assume good intentions. They assume growth is happening behind the scenes. But grace isn't infinite, and eventually, the question shifts from why are they being treated this way to why does this keep happening? That's a dangerous transition. Because once the audience starts asking why, the spell breaks. They stop reacting emotionally and start evaluating behavior. They compare promises to outcomes, image to impact, and that's when the tone changes. Hollywood is especially ruthless about this. It runs on momentum, on perception, on the belief that someone is still ascending. The moment that belief cracks, enthusiasm cools fast. Meetings get postponed. Projects get reworked. Invitations quietly stop coming. Not out of malice, out of calculation. Because Hollywood doesn't reward intention. It rewards results. And when the results don't match the rhetoric, the industry moves on without ceremony. No public breakup. No announcement. Just distance. That's why the shift feels so sudden to people watching from the outside. 1 minute someone is everywhere. The next minute, they're explaining why things didn't work out. But insiders recognize the signs immediately. The language changes. The headlines soften, then sharpen. Profiles become more skeptical. Praise turns into polite neutrality. And neutrality, in this business, is the beginning of the end. What makes this moment especially revealing is that the criticism isn't coming from obvious opponents. It's coming from people who wanted the story to succeed. People who defended it, promoted it, amplified it. Disappointment hits harder than opposition. Because disappointment means expectations existed and weren't met. There's also something else happening beneath the surface: fatigue. Cultural fatigue. Audiences are overwhelmed by constant moral framing. Every conversation turned into a referendum. Every disagreement treated as a character flaw. People aren't rejecting causes. They're rejecting performance. They want substance, specifics, proof of impact. They want to see effort that isn't immediately monetized or narrated. They want work that speaks for itself. And when they don't see that, they disengage. That disengagement is what you're seeing now. Not hatred, not obsession, indifference, shrugs instead of outrage, laughter instead of defense. That's far more damaging. Because outrage keeps you relevant. Silence makes you invisible. This is where many public figures panic. They mistake fading interest for misunderstanding. So they repeat the message louder. They reframe again. They remind everyone of past struggles, past slights, past injustices. But repetition doesn't restore credibility. It accelerates doubt. Audiences don't want to be told how to feel forever. They want to see something new. Growth. Accountability. Evolution. And that's the crossroads we're at now. The old approach, carefully managed vulnerability, constant self-reference, strategic alignment with every trending cause, has stopped working. Not because people suddenly became cruel, but because they became discerning. They've seen this movie before. And the question hanging in the air isn't cruel or dismissive. It's simple. What's next, besides another explanation? That's the pressure point. Because the answer can't be another interview, another statement, another attempt to control the narrative. It has to be action. Real action. Quiet action. Action that doesn't center the storyteller. Whether that happens or not will determine what comes next. Because reinvention is still possible, but only if it's earned. And earning it means letting go of the script that used to work. The moment you cling to it out of fear is the moment the audience fully checks out. And that's the danger zone. Here's where things get complicated, and where a lot of public figures lose the room without realizing it. Sympathy is contextual. It's not about whether someone has faced hardship. It's about who they're talking to and how often they ask for it. For a while, people were willing to listen. They understood that entering powerful institutions comes with real pressure. They recognized that unfair treatment exists, and that some criticism crossed lines that never should have been crossed. That empathy was genuine. But empathy has limits when the messenger never stops centering themselves. At some point, audiences begin to feel a disconnect between the scale of the complaints and the scale of the privilege involved. When someone has wealth, influence, global reach, and a dedicated PR infrastructure, constant framing as powerless starts to ring hollow. Not offensive, just unconvincing. And that's the sympathy gap. It opens when people think, I believe you struggled, but I don't believe you're helpless. And once that gap opens, every message has to work twice as hard. Because now the audience isn't just listening, they're measuring. They're comparing lived reality to rhetoric. They're weighing hardship against opportunity. They're noticing how often pain is revisited, retold, and repackaged. What once felt like vulnerability starts to feel like leverage. This is where many narratives collapse. Not because they were entirely false, but because they became the only story being told. Growth stalled. Perspective narrowed. Everything looped back to the same grievances. And the more that happened, the more people wondered why so much energy was spent revisiting the past instead of building something tangible in the present. That's when skepticism sets in. You can see it in the questions people ask now. They're no longer emotional. They're practical. What has actually been built? Who has actually benefited? Where is the measurable impact? Those questions aren't attacks. They're the standard applied to anyone claiming influence. And influence without results doesn't age well. There's also a deeper issue here, one most people are reluctant to name. When someone constantly positions themselves as a victim while occupying an elite tier of society, it creates cognitive dissonance. The audience doesn't know where to place them. Are they powerful or powerless? Are they leading or reacting? Are they above the system or trapped by it? If the answer changes depending on convenience, trust erodes. That erosion doesn't happen loudly. It happens quietly. People stop defending. Stop explaining. Stop giving the benefit of the doubt. They stop caring enough to argue. That's the phase we're in now. What makes this especially striking is that none of this required a coordinated backlash. No campaign. No pile-on. Just gradual disengagement. A cooling of interest. A sense that the conversation has run its course. And when a comedian steps into that moment and cracks a joke, it doesn't feel cruel, it feels reflective. Like comedy holding up a mirror that people were already staring into. That's why the laughter mattered. It wasn't mocking pain. It was acknowledging contradiction. And contradiction is deadly to carefully curated images. Because once people notice it, they can't unsee it. This is also where many celebrities miscalculate their next move. They assume the solution is to remind everyone why sympathy was deserved in the first place. But audiences don't move backward emotionally. Once perspective shifts, it doesn't reset. You can't ask people to feel something they've already processed. What they want instead is evidence of self-awareness. Evidence that the person understands how they're perceived and is willing to adjust, not double down. That requires humility. And humility is hard when your entire brand has been built on moral certainty. But without it, the gap widens. And when that happens, even genuine efforts get interpreted as strategic. Even real intentions get filtered through suspicion. The audience starts asking not, is this good? But But why now? That question lingers over everything. This is the point where a public figure either surprises people or confirms their doubts. Where they either step out of the spotlight to do something meaningful or stay in it explaining why things didn't go as planned. One path rebuilds credibility slowly, the other accelerates irrelevance. And no amount of media training can change that outcome once the audience has made up its mind. Because at the end of the day, people aren't asking for perfection. They're asking for authenticity that doesn't revolve around self-preservation. Whether that lesson gets absorbed or ignored will decide what happens next. Hollywood rarely announces when it's done with someone. It doesn't need to. There's no press release, no public confrontation, no dramatic fallout, just a quiet shift in behavior that says everything. Calls slow down, project stall, enthusiasm fades, and suddenly, the person who is everywhere is explaining why nothing is happening. That's not punishment, that's indifference. And indifference is Hollywood's final verdict. For a while, the industry believed in the story. It was compelling. It was timely. It checked every box: prestige, controversy, moral framing, global attention. Executives didn't just see a person, they saw a narrative they could sell. But Hollywood doesn't invest in stories forever. It invests in momentum. When momentum stalls, patience runs out. Big deals come with big expectations. Not just visibility, but output. Not just intention, but execution. When those expectations aren't met, the narrative shifts behind the scenes long before it shows up in headlines. Suddenly the language changes. Promising becomes challenging. Bold becomes unclear. In development becomes on hold. And none of it is personal. It's business. What often surprises people is how fast that shift happens once confidence is lost. Hollywood is built on risk management. If someone starts looking unpredictable, difficult to position, or overly focused on controlling the message, the cost-benefit calculation changes. At that point, it doesn't matter how famous you are. It matters how reliable you are. And reliability isn't about being perfect. It's about being focused, about delivering something concrete that doesn't require constant explanation or defense. When every project arrives with a preemptive narrative, why it matters, why criticism is unfair, why context must be understood, it signals insecurity. It tells decision-makers that the work might not stand on its own. That's a red flag. Audiences feel this too, even if they can't articulate it. They sense when something is being sold harder than it should be, when meaning is being insisted upon rather than discovered. That's when attention drifts. And once attention drifts, Hollywood follows it elsewhere. What's happening now isn't a scandal. It's a cooling, a gradual realization that the brand no longer excites curiosity, that it doesn't generate anticipation, only reactions. Reactions aren't enough. You can't build a lasting presence on rebuttals and reframing. Eventually, people want something new, something that isn't about past grievances or personal validation. They want substance. This is why reinvention becomes so difficult at this stage. Because the audience isn't hostile, they're tired. And tired audiences don't argue. They move on. That's the hardest position to recover from. You can survive controversy. You can survive criticism. You can even survive ridicule. But surviving irrelevance requires humility and patience. It requires stepping away from the spotlight long enough to earn a return, not demand one. And that's the choice on the table now. Not a comeback tour. Not another explanation. Not another rebrand. But a pause. A genuine one. Whether that happens or not will determine how the story ends, or whether it quietly fades without resolution. Because Hollywood has already moved on to the next narrative. It always does. The only question left is whether the person at the center of this one is willing to do the one thing fame makes hardest. Stop talking. Start doing. This is the part of the story no one can script. Because once the noise fades, once the interviews slow, the headlines thin out, and the audience stops reacting, the only thing left is choice. Not branding. Not messaging. Choice. Every public figure eventually reaches this point, whether they want to or not. The moment when attention is no longer guaranteed. When relevance has to be earned again instead of assumed. When the platform still exists, but the patience doesn't. This is where reinvention either becomes real or impossible. The truth is, the door isn't closed. It never fully is. There's still a massive audience, still resources, still influence most people could only dream of. The opportunity to do meaningful work hasn't disappeared, but the rules have changed. People aren't looking for another explanation of the past. They're not interested in revisiting old grievances. They don't want to be told what something represents. They want to see what it produces. Real impact doesn't need narration. It doesn't need a rollout. It doesn't need a moral frame attached to it. It shows up quietly, consistently, and speaks for itself. That's what audiences respect now. The irony is that stepping away from self-focus is often the fastest way to regain trust. When the work stops centering the person and starts centering the outcome, credibility begins to rebuild, slowly but genuinely. But that requires letting go of control. It means accepting that not every effort will be praised, that not every silence is an attack, that not every criticism needs a response. It means allowing space for people to form their own opinions without guiding them there. For someone used to managing perception, that's terrifying. Yet it's the only path forward. Because the alternative is clinging to a version of relevance that no longer exists. Trying to revive a narrative the audience has already moved past. Doubling down on a story that once worked but now only reminds people why they tuned out. And history is unforgiving to those who refuse to adapt. This moment isn't about punishment or downfall. It's about transition. About what happens when a cultural era ends and a new one begins. One that values authenticity over performance, substance over symbolism, action over explanation. The spotlight will always move on. That's inevitable. What isn't inevitable is fading with it. There's still a chance to surprise people. To shift the conversation not by insisting on relevance, but by earning it. By doing something quietly meaningful enough that people notice without being told to. That's the difference between chasing attention and commanding respect. And right now, that's the crossroads. No more shields. No more automatic sympathy. No more guaranteed applause. Just the work. What happens next depends entirely on whether that reality is embraced or resisted. Because in the end, the audience isn't cruel. They're just honest. And they're waiting to see who shows up when the performance is over.